the way it was back in the day. Wait a second, where's New Amsterdam? Yeah, I mean, the Manhattan is still derived from the Dutch. We don't call it New Amsterdam anymore, but this was back when it was a Dutch settlement. And they built this wall along what is now Wall Street. Why'd they build that wall? He's getting attacked. Yeah, who was fighting him? Yeah, I mean, actually, it turns out, I mean, that is the most popular explanation for the wall, and it certainly probably was at various times used for that purpose, to go out and raid the indigenous population and then hide behind the wall when they came back mad. But actually, it was originally built to guard against the British. They didn't want the Brits coming in and taking over, which the Brits eventually did, as we know. That's why it's called New York and not New Amsterdam. But for a while, they held off with that wall there. So yeah, this is a map of what New Amsterdam, what we would call lower Manhattan, would have looked like back in the day. Apparently, we've also filled in so much of it that, you know, the sea levels are different than they were. So this is where it would have been before we landfilled a bunch of stuff down there and made some new places to build things on. That was linked up by one of you to Karen Ho's Liquidated, an ethnography of Wall Street, which appears to us from Guest, in which she talks about doing anthropology among the bankers and the ways in which capitalism has changed so much. And I suppose that Wall Street speaks to us as an enduring symbol of a huge theme in anthropological research, something that we talk about a ton. Nothing. Can't you see that? The huge theme of class and inequality. How am I going to say that? Because I'm being funny. Because what I'm trying to say is this has not been a huge theme in anthropology. And in fact, I think Guest kind of buries it here at the end of the unit in chapter 10. And if you're only reading the essentials of cultural anthropology, his other version of this textbook, this chapter isn't even there. It's gone. It's disappeared. It's not smaller even than mine. It's not even there. Now, I guess I'm kind of doing that myself by only teaching to half the class on the last day before break. So I am equally at fault here for burying the theme of class and inequality. But you do have to think about, you know, I mean, we read about race and ethnicity, gender. We just came off reading about sexuality, right? Which would you rather read about, sexuality or class and inequality? Which was more fun? Don't answer that. I know which is more fun. You know which is more fun. It's always sexier to talk about sexuality than it is to talk about class and inequality. It's in the damn name. So there you go. Guest begins by asking a question. Is inequality a natural part of human culture? And I think he asks this question because there are people who claim that all human societies have always been unequal, and that that's just a way that humans are. We're just status-filled animals who like to have hierarchies and throw things at each other, and we're just like the status-obsessed chimpanzees or something. To that, I'm going to say that there actually is no natural state of human inequality. That is to say, we see all kinds of different ways in which humans have been equal and unequal from each other. If we did a historical survey and a cross-cultural survey, this happens in all kinds of different ways. I will also claim here, though, I want us to be careful that there is also not a natural state of equality. We'll be talking in a little bit later in the economy chapter about the hunters and the gatherers, who are often held up as an example of egalitarian societies. And some anthropologists have wanted to say that that is the natural state of humanity, to live in a state of egalitarianism or equality. And certainly, Shaylin, if we look around, we do see, if we look in the past, what do we see back there that people used to do, or they still do? We still do this, actually. This hasn't gone away. What can we do when we're being good? Sharing and cooperating and collaboration and reciprocity. We see this across all human societies. People aren't all bad. We do see lots of this. There are some societies that have been relatively more egalitarian. I am going to say that those are not a natural state of humanity, that neither one of those states are natural. They're just ways, part of a range of ways in which people have made themselves. And we do see things like reciprocity and sharing and people giving out kindness to each other. There it is. You can barely see the hand. Even in hierarchical societies. We also see a range of forms of hierarchy, which is something that Elvis talked about, different ways in which people might try to gain status. What's one of the weird ways that people can gain status in other societies, Elvis?
They give gifts, and they give gifts to maintain their status of hierarchy.
Yeah, now this is might seem odd to us. In fact, it seems like the opposite that you'd be doing. But yes, there are plenty of societies in which you prove that you should be the big person by giving things away. And so you would attain status by giving, or probably more, maintain your status by being able to give away a lot. One of the most famous anthropological examples is the Potlatch in the Northwest coast of the Americas, which was studied by Franz Boas and many people, other people, in which you would have these feasts in which you would compete for status by giving things away. Some of you, did you see in your intro class, have you seen this film yet, Ongka's Big Moka? Oh, shoot. Maybe I should show it to you all. Ongka's Big Mucka, in which he gives away all this stuff. I have flattened you. I have won. Oh, we'll have to put that down for a movie day. All right. That's true. I haven't seen that since intro, and none of you took intro with me. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of different ways in which we can have forms of hierarchy which are not all the same. And our idea of social class and being stratified and having our life chances determined by our wealth or our income is actually a pretty recent idea, or recent form of human society. Again, there are all different forms of hierarchy, but the idea that it would be determined by your social class is a relatively new one. Now, Guest goes on to talk about 4 different people who have given us insights into social class. None of you got excited about any of these people, at least in your web comments. Don't know, maybe they were too boring. But let's think about this. If we wanted to turn to somebody to tell us about social class, who would we turn to first? Who's the first person that comes to your mind? Ah, that's right. Karl Marx. Where did you learn about Karl Marx? Sociology. Oh, yes. Marx is the sociologists love him too. Right. So, yeah. And so Marx's idea is that, in some ways that society under capitalism was dividing into 2 main classes: the bourgeoisie, who owned the means of production, the factories and stuff that was making things, and the proletariat, who had nothing to sell but their own labor power. And that was, what'd you read in sociology? You read any Marx?
I haven't read his books directly, but he's just mentioned it a lot every time he asks everything.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, Guest mentions this book. There it is, a Penguin classic. A classic. The Communist Manifesto. Anybody read this? This should be required reading. It's only like, it's actually so short. It's only like 20 pages because it's a manifesto. It has some very famous lines in it, like, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, which many Americans believe is in the Constitution, but it's actually in the Communist Manifesto. That was the idea. From each according to their ability, to each according to their need. The thing about the Communist Manifesto is when Engels and Marx were writing it, it's often the only thing. If anybody reads any Marx at all, they only read this. And it is short and everybody should read it. Don't get me wrong. But it's not Marx being smart in the sense of it was written at a time when the world looked kind of like this on the cover, when people were actually in a revolutionary mode and they were trying to overthrow society. And so this was written to give like stimulus to the ongoing, what Marx and Engels believe would be the ongoing revolution. So it's kind of like getting your theory from a poster on the wall or a pamphlet, because that was the equivalent of it. Later on, when this revolution didn't pan out the way Marx and Engels thought it would, Marx got much more reflective about this and turned out a lot more of analytical work, which was much more complex and nuanced than this idea of two classes. But like I said, most people just read this because it's more fun, but it's more like a pamphlet. It's a manifesto. It's revolutionary. The second person that people turn to after Marx is they come up and they find Max Weber. And Guest discusses Max Weber's ideas of prestige and life chances, basically kind of talking to us about more classes, more social classes than simply two, and that people would rise and fall in these and compete for status. Weber also, and we'll see Weber later on for some of his ideas about the state and how in some ways it's not just a capitalist system, but it's our ideas that we should have a government which has a monopoly over what he called the legitimate use of force. So that it's not just me going out and hitting somebody else and then they hitting me back, but you have a military or a police who is authorized to use force and the rest of us give it up. Like I said, we'll come back to that later, but the point is, or when we talk about politics, this is an idea that was in a lecture that Weber gave called Politics as a Vocation. And it's super interesting stuff. In some ways, it's seen as more analytical than Marx and Engels. Weber was not trying to create any revolutions. He was just professoring and talking to people and trying to analyze the society that he had. The third person that Guest draws upon is Pierre Bourdieu, who writes about, well, he wrote many things, but in this case, Guest is drawing us to his idea of education and social reproduction. Anybody read any Bourdieu? Did he come up in sociology?
Actually, I haven't really heard of him this year.
Till this year. Yeah, he's over there in France, and so he's sort of used, a lot of sociologists do draw on him, a lot of anthropologists as well. People in education actually sometimes draw on him because one of his ideas is, how do we have an educational system which is meant, of course, I mean, in some ways, the educational system, you're trying to be socially mobile. You're trying to move up in the world, trying to educate the people to be citizens and to have a better life. How is it that such a system can nevertheless, in many ways, reinforce the class society or the social reproduction? So he turned to Bourdieu gives us a couple of points. One is the idea of habitus, which I'll talk about in a second. And the other is the idea of cultural capital. And so one of the things that Bourdieu said is that in some ways, it isn't just your economic resources. It isn't just your income and your wealth. It's what you do with those things. And if you're raised in a certain social class, you know how to behave in a certain way, which helps you arrive at certain things. You know which college to go to and what job to get and how to hold your fork right and all the things. So one of his books was called Distinction. Of course, nobody could understand what Bourdieu was saying, in part because he was writing in French and some of his work was badly translated. So it's super interesting stuff. But for example, the idea of habitus, which Bourdieu talked about, an outline of a theory of practice, as a way to try and figure out why is it that some people don't end up trying to get, say, the best position they can, or try to get a better job or better their chances in life. And what he said about habitus is super interesting, but it's very difficult to understand. He said that for many people, the most improbable practices are excluded as unthinkable. That in some ways, it's just so out of your realm of thought that you can't even imagine it. Or at the cost of the double negation, which inclines agents to make a virtue of necessity, that is, to refuse what is anyway refused and to love the inevitable. We don't want to live in that neighborhood anyway because they're all snotty. Make a virtue of necessity, refuse what is anyway refused, and to love the inevitable. So a lot of people have tried to figure out what Bourdieu was talking about with habitus. He called it the durably installed generative principle of regulated improvisations. Like I said, not the easiest thing to understand. What he was trying to get at, I think, was how we get these things built into our bodies and our environment in such a way that we seem to be making choices, and we are making choices. We're improvising, but we're nevertheless in some ways reproducing the social structure as we go along. Said that habitus was history turned into nature or denied as such. Now, the reason in some ways I'm going on about this is that we might think of habitus as a better way or a different way to say culture. All the social environment that we inherit and becomes so natural to us. It's our history, but it's become so natural to us that we don't recognize it as our habitus anymore. We have to revisit Bourdieu someday. The fourth person that Guest draws upon is Leith Mullings, who's, I think, in some ways our best person here, talking about intersectionality. I think this is where he does intersectionality the best, drawing on Leith Mullings' work, how class, race, and gender might intersect. Leith Mullings was very involved in this chapter. Guest describes her work with the Harlem Birthright project, which was a very admirable project and also in some ways hard to do. So this is on 370 and 371. I would also say that after that, she became very involved in the African Burial Ground project and doing a kind of ethnographic study of how to best deal with the fact that that Clint Smith discusses that so many people had been buried under the streets of New York City, and how to sort of honor that. So this is a very difficult but necessary project. So Guest draws on these four people: Marx, Weber, Bourdieu, Mullings. What do you notice about these four people? Yeah. Yeah, Marx was not an anthropologist, although we draw upon him. Weber too, he's over there. We draw upon Weber, and the sociologists do too. Bourdieu might have been. Bourdieu was kind of straddling the boundary of anthropology and sociology. Leith Mullings was an anthropologist. But you're right, they have a kind of, most of them are kind of tangentially related to anthropology. Anything else you notice about them? Well, two of them are super old. They're all dead, but two of them are super old. So Karl Marx was born in Germany, didn't even make it to the 1900. Weber, also born in Germany, made it into 1920. Bourdieu was born in France, made it up to about 2002. And Leith Mullings, although she did spend most of her life in the United States in New York City, was actually born in Jamaica and had a kind of outsider perspective to this. So again, these are mostly people who are coming to anthropology from the outside, or even completely outside, and most of them are coming to the United States as outsiders. We might ask ourselves, well, wait a second, what has US anthropology contributed to this? How have we been able to study class and inequality in a place like the United States? Anthropologists did come up with one idea, which is an idea of Oscar Lewis, he called it the culture of poverty. Oscar Lewis was a student of Ruth Benedict. He went and wrote some very vivid accounts, and probably is the one who is most responsible for passing this phrase into social policy and things like that. Now, his idea was that what we needed to do, because there was this culture of poverty, was have a pretty large government intervention in order to change the course of things, in order to intervene so that people would not be stuck in this culture of poverty. However, you might think, what might happen to people if you say, yes, there they are, those people, they are in a culture of poverty? What do we think about people who are stuck in a culture of poverty? Tiana. Yeah, it's a pretty stigmatizing phrase. I don't think he meant it that way, but it makes it sound like there's nothing you can do, right? They're just stuck. It's going to perpetuate itself in the same way that we talked about how culture became this thing that's deterministic for people. And it also implies, I'm glad you talked about this, that it implies that there's some sort of personal responsibility for this. The reason you're poor is your own fault, right? So, yeah, this was not the best idea. In fact, I'm willing to guess, I have sometimes called it, well, it may have been the worst idea of anything that anthropologists came out, at least since Boas, not as an idea, but in terms of how it was used and still gets used today. And so now, I mean, in some ways, Guest spends much of the rest of the chapter talking about anthropologists who have criticized this idea. So it's like anthropology introduced a terrible idea, and now we have to spend our time criticizing an idea that we probably should have not introduced in the first place. So yeah, not the best. Part of the reason that it's been so difficult to study class and inequality in the United States is that we believe that we don't have social class in the United States. Probably still to this day, if you ask most people about their social class, they will tell you that they are in the middle class. The middle class is this huge idea that we have that almost everybody says they're in. We also like to believe that we in the United States aren't like those other societies, say in India or in places where your life is destined by your caste. Now, I think what I will say about this is certainly ideas like caste and hierarchy are important in other societies, but we often overdo it and think that in some ways those societies are totally determined by caste. And we don't recognize the ways in which our own society is also shaped by similar kinds of hierarchies. Right, Alex? What's the reality of the United States? What are our life chances shaped by?
So I talked about how things like financial and cultural aspects of life go from generation to generation. So in public health, we typically talk about if your family grew up in poverty, for a lot of people it's hard for them to get out of poverty, so it kind of carries from generation to generation.
Yeah, if you look statistically, I mean, we feel like we can move our social class. If you look statistically, it's just not as prevalent as many people believe it is. I'm not trying to say everybody is stuck. Far be it from me to say that, but this has been pretty durable in US society for a while. There's evidence that it has become more durable over time, that is kind of hardened, but it's still, yeah, I mean, it's heavily influenced, I would say. Not impossible, but heavily influenced. Now, there's a couple different ways that we can measure these statistically, which doesn't always get at all the things we talked about. Bourdieu, for example, might talk more about cultural capital or being able to move in different kinds of societies, but just statistically, we can look at the United States, and if we look at income, which is how much you make during a year, we can already see that income is highly unequal across the United States, that some people make a ton more than others. The thing about income, though, that at least we know it. It's something that we report. It's something that we have to tell people about on the income tax. There's another form of inequality related to money, which is much more difficult to get a hold of, which is wealth. What's the difference between income and wealth? Yeah.
I guess you could say wealth is how much money you have left over after you do with your necessities.
Wealth is your total assets. It's everything you have. So it's, income is what you get on an annual basis. Wealth is what you already own, accumulate, minus your debts, etc. It's interesting. Somebody who suddenly has an income increase, let's say one of your relatives suddenly started making $10,000 more a year. What do people usually do once they get a little bonus like that? Yeah, usually for good reason, people want to get stuff that's better. You spend it on things that are, important. What do you do if you have wealth? I don't know. Not too many of us have wealth. But I would say that unlike income, the people who have wealth are always trying to hide it. It's very difficult to even get a sense of actually how much difference there is in wealth because everybody's trying to put it in places where you can't find it. They want to hide it, especially from people who are collecting the income tax, right? Because the income tax is you're being taxed on how much money is coming in. But if you have wealth, you want to get that out of the sight of people so they don't tax you or they don't even ask for it. Actually, how do you hide wealth? What's a good way to hide wealth? And we shall introduce some cultural capital into this class. So if any of you come into wealth, you know what to do with it. Where do you want to stash it? Yes.
Other countries.
Yeah, it's always good to get it into the Bahamas, get it into a Swiss bank account. If you can offshore it somewhere, that's always a nice thing to be able to do. Yeah, but I mean, that's a little hard. There's a different way to sort of stash it away so that people can't see it as much. If you can't, even if you can't put it in the Bahamas, where do you want to put it? Where do you want to hide your wealth?
Bitcoin?
Huh?
Bitcoin?
Bitcoin? Oh, Bitcoin's a little tough. That might be a good idea, but it's a little bit tricky. It goes up and down, and the government's trying to track you down. I mean, I definitely put a little bit there. I just wouldn't want to stash all of it there. Yeah, Tiana, where would you put it?
Investments?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely want to have it in, maybe not Bitcoin, but you definitely want to have it in some sort of stock market somewhere, stashed away, so that you're only getting a little bit of the income. And that's what you're taxed on. And that's what you can live on. In fact, some of the billionaires, they've done studies, they don't pay any income tax because what you do is you have all your money stashed in the stock market or whatever, and then you take a loan against that in order to live. So now you don't even have any income. You have negative income. You don't have to pay any income tax. Get some money back from the government, just like a poor person. Yeah, you have all that well stashed away. Yeah.
I was gonna say maybe like a slush fund.
Yeah, I mean, you want to get it, a lot of people try and keep it with different relatives. So you want to keep it in your grandparents' generation, right? So it's off the books for you. Or you try to put it into your grandkids somewhere where, nobody's taxing them. So they try and move it around in different ways, have a slush fund, buy up you buy a big ranch somewhere, there's all kinds of ways. But if you can, try to do that. I mean, what you really want is not income, you want wealth. That's what you want. Anyway, by all measures, the wealth gap, you might say, is much more. It's even more unequal than income, even if we can even find out about it. Now, interestingly, Guest gives us a sense. He has a table on page 380 of the racial gap between, say, white and black families. And if you look at the median income, a different way for us non-statisticians, basically an average income. We don't use average income because if a billionaire walks in, then it messes the average all up. You use the median to get a better sense of what's going on. So the median income of a white household is about 69,000 in 2019, of black 40,300, which doesn't look that bad. But if you look at wealth, if you add on the wealth, that's when you see this enormous difference. So in terms of income, you can have people, relatively similar incomes, right? I mean, it's a 1.7 times at the median, but the wealth gap is still rather large. It's variable over time, but it doesn't actually seem to be shrinking. And the wealth gap is probably a legacy of the fact that certain people were themselves owned and considered to be a form of wealth. In fact, I think our tour guide, DeMaris, says that was the single largest form of wealth in the United States was held in enslaved persons. And so after, in different places, well, Alex, you gave us this quote.
Yeah, so then I